Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, Episode 8. I am the show's host, Kyle, and today I'm mostly going to be talking about Trump's first State of the Union address, although I guess not everybody's calling it a State of the Union address because Trump hasn't been in office for a full year, but this is basically what it is, as Trump was speaking in front of a joint session of Congress with the Supreme Court and other top U.S. officials there. Before I get into the content of the episode, I would just like to ask my listeners that if you're on iTunes, please go to iTunes and give me a 5-star rating and review. It would help the show to grow and help the show to get out to new listeners, maybe make people a little bit more interested in clicking on the show. So if you could do that, that would be very helpful. I also suggest that everybody head to Facebook and type Foreign Policy Focus in the search bar and join my group that I have for Foreign Policy Focus. Not only is it a group for the podcast, but it's also a group for people who are interested in foreign policy to discuss the ideas and the current news events of what's going on in the world, maybe ask questions to other members. If you're having trouble messaging a certain part of the foreign policy non-interventionist message, there's plenty of people there that would be more than willing to give you some advice on how best to handle it. With that, I guess we're ready to jump into Trump's speech. The speech clocked in at an hour, although without all the applause, it probably could have been about a 40-minute speech. There's an awful lot of standing and applauding. I think Paul Ryan was standing up about every 30 seconds to clap for something. Pretty early on in Trump's speech, we have him talking about the F-35. Trump mentions the F-35 while he's talking about how he's going to try to control and cut down on the budget a little bit. One of this, is Trump likes to famously say, is negotiate better contracts, and this is him bragging about a contract he negotiated with Lockheed Martin to get the cost of the F-35 down. Well, he did do this, and the cost of the F-35 did go down after Trump made some almost threats saying that he would go to Boeing to produce a better plane or produce a different jet that was cheaper. Lockheed Martin was willing to come down on the cost of the F-35 jets. So there's a bit of truth to this. However, it was always the plan that the cost of the jets would come down over time as more and more jets were produced, and we're seeing more and more jets be produced and sold to different countries as well. So, probably a little bit of truth in both, that Trump did negotiate a lower price and that the price was going to come down a little bit anyways. He then says that the F-35 is a great jet, and this is simply untrue. Looking at all the problems that the F-35 has had over the past couple of years, as the government has said that the plane was ready to get for combat, most of the kinks have been worked out. I don't think the planes are catching fire quite so often, but there was a time when one in every few flights would end up with the planes catching fire. There was a lot of problems with the planes not being able to fly at night or fly in the rain. However, a lot of those bugs were worked out, but a story came out this week that says the F-35's targeting systems don't work when the plane's moving. So if the plane is trying to, do some air-to-ground strikes, the plane has to stop. It can't be moving at that time. And so this is a problem, because the F-35 was supposed to replace the A-10 Warthog, and the A-10 Warthog is a really good plane because it could take a lot of rounds and it'll fly through pretty much anything. However, the F-35 isn't quite so durable, so if the plane can't move and shoot and things are shooting back at the plane, it would cause some real problems for the F-35. On top of this, the F-35 program is going to cost the U.S. taxpayers $1 trillion over its lifetime, so we're looking at a situation where the U.S. government is producing an inferior product with the F-35 and is costing us tons and tons of money, and is simply not worth it. Other problems with the F-35 is that it's easily seen on a lot of radar, and while it was supposed to be a stealth fighter plane, I believe it's even picked up on the World War II radars. The plane was designed to be everything. It was supposed to replace the A-10 Warthog and the F-16 fighter jets. However, in an attempt to become everything, it's really become nothing. I don't know, they had to re-outfit a lot of the aircraft carriers because the planes were burning a hole in the runways on the aircraft carrier. So just tons of problem with the F-35. And while they tried to make a plane that could do everything, it looks like they created a plane that could do nothing. And while Trump brags about this, whenever we see the F-35 in combat, hopefully nothing bad happens, because, I would hate to see U.S. pilots have bad things happen to them. It's likely that we'll start to see some of the failures of the F-35 if they ever have to be in combat. Trump did make a statement in which he said radical Islamic terror, something that Obama had been unwilling to say, and there's already been a lot of controversy over if Trump should have said those words in that order or not. I think there are some advantages and some disadvantages to him saying that. The obvious disadvantage would be that Americans may think that all Islamic people are terrorists, and so now we have to eliminate the Muslim people, or something along those lines. There is some legitimate fear that this does cause increased hatred and fear of Muslim people, but at the same time, there is a reason why there is so many jihadists in the world, and that is Americans have been at war with Muslim people for the past 25 years, and refusing to say the term radical Islamic terrorism, I believe, allowed Obama to wage war against so many Muslim countries for so long without ever acknowledging that there was terrorism and there was blowback from it. So we have a situation where there are Western countries that are attacked by jihadists. And the jihadists attack the Western countries because of blowback. It's because of U.S. interventionism in the Middle East that leads people to become radicalized because their family members, their friends, or their country is being destroyed by Western countries, and then they go and attack the Western countries in retaliation. While I just want to be clear that I'm not endorsing the Muslims attacking the U.S. In retaliation. I'm just saying this is the natural way that human beings act, that if you attack a country, some percentage of the population of that country will become extremely angry and retaliate. This is what happens. This is why we have wars. And it's nothing new. It's not that Muslim people are inherently hateful. It's just that whenever you attack people and you kill millions of them, eventually you're going to have to pay some consequences for that. So if we want to continue our foreign policy of going abroad and looking for monsters and bombing all these Muslim countries, well, eventually there's going to be some terrorism in return. But back to the point, hiding that this is happening like Obama did by refusing to say that there is terrorism coming out of Muslim countries isn't helpful either. American people and people in the West need to understand that there are consequences for the interventionism, that we can't go around and simply bomb countries, and we can't bomb Syria, and we can't bomb Libya, and we can't bomb Yemen, and we can't bomb Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia without ever facing any consequences of this. And so it's definitely a situation where there's no right answers, and it may not be the best thing to use the term radical Islamic terrorism, but it's also not the best thing to hide from the issue either, like Obama did. So both people are wrong, and both of them should just stop bombing the Muslim countries, but I don't think that's going to happen either. Moving on in Trump's speech, one of the next points he made is that the Department of Justice told him that most people who are convicted of terrorism in the United States come from outside the United States. So the numbers that Trump cited from the Department of Justice are probably correct in that most people who are convicted of terrorism in the United States are from outside the United States. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that all people who would carry out attacks in the United States are from foreign countries. A lot of times what happens is the FBI will either use informants or undercover agents to radicalize people or attempt to radicalize people who aren't necessarily terrorists themselves. The FBI or their informants will approach somebody and show them lots of videos of Americans' foreign policy killing people overseas, either through bombs or troops on the ground. A lot of times they'll highlight times where children or innocent civilians were killed in mass numbers by U.S. troops until the people become extremely upset about the U.S. foreign policy. And then they'll start to push, wouldn't you like to do something about this? How are we going to do something about this? And eventually what they will do is they will give the person either the weapons or a plan and kind of push them into carrying that plan out. A lot of times the people actually would never have meant any harm to Americans if it wasn't for the FBI intervention and really pushing people into becoming jihadists or giving them the plans and saying, hey, wouldn't you like to do something about this? And so it's really a situation where we're creating crime and then we're saying, oh, hey, look at all this crime over here. So this is probably where the Department of Justice numbers come from. I wouldn't read too much into it and think that, oh, Muslim people are very dangerous to Americans. Like I said, what's likely to happen is a lot of these people are just people who are entrapped by the FBI into doing something they never would have done if it wasn't the FBI pushing them to do it. One of Trump's next statements on foreign policy had to do with the U.S. shouldn't allow people from countries that we can't cannot vet the people coming from. So in a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, like give Syria, for example, where you have a civil war going on, there's not a lot of records on people, because even if some paper records did exist, a lot of times the buildings may have blown up or burned down, or they're just inaccessible to anybody looking to gain background information on those people. While in the US it's pretty easy to have a background check run on you, it may not be possible for somebody coming from Syria. So, Trump does have a point here, saying that, we don't know who we're letting in from these countries and that some of them may be a threat. However, this is a result of the United States foreign policy in these countries, where a lot of times we've provoked these violent uprisings to start, or we have started the wars ourselves, and then we can no longer vet people coming from that country. So we kind of put these people in a really bad situation, and now they have little to no recourse on how they could ever get out of the country that we made so terrible in the first place. So it's really a difficult situation to deal with, and we need to figure out a way to make sure that the people coming here aren't a threat to Americans, because a lot of innocent Americans like you and me and the people listening didn't do anything wrong, and it was our government that provoked people into hating us and wanting to attack us, and it wasn't necessarily the fault of any Americans here. However, we also bombed these people's countries, destroyed their homes, and now they're starving and need a place to go. And so it's a really difficult situation to figure out. If anybody finds a really good answer, let me know and send it to me, because I'll certainly advocate for anything that we could come up with. Trump did say that they're looking at new vetting procedures to help to figure out who's not a terrorist and who is a terrorist. I don't know what those procedures are, so I really can't analyze that, but if he does come up with something good, that's certainly something we should give him credit for. However, I don't know what his solution could be here. Trump then moved into talking about having a new plan to defeat ISIS. He talked about how nasty the people of ISIS are and how we need to work to stomp out ISIS. We don't know all the details from the Pentagon plan to defeat ISIS. However, two notes we do know from the plan are that they're recommending an increase of U.S. troops in Syria and recommending that the U.S. target ISIS across the globe. Both of these cases are going to end up badly. I think the first one is probably a more dangerous solution than the second. Having the U.S. boots on the ground in Syria is dangerous for a lot of reasons. The first is that there's so many countries bombing in Syria. We could end up with a situation where Russia accidentally bombs U.S. troops in Syria, or the Syrian army bombs U.S. troops in Syria. No doubt that this would lead to escalation of war between either the U.S. and Russia or the U.S. and Syria, and create a much larger problem out of something that's a big problem in Syria, but it's not war between the U.S. and Russia. There's also the issue that if we have more boots on the ground in Syria, this is going to lead to more blowback and more hatred for the United States. Eventually, one of the U.S. troops in Syria will end up killing a civilian, just leading to more hatred against the United States. This is unfortunately true. It happens. This is why war is nasty, and we shouldn't be involved in it unless we absolutely have to. And there's no reason we absolutely have to be in Syria. As I've highlighted before, the local countries in Syria and some of the local groups like the Kurds are doing a very good job of getting rid of ISIS on their own, and they don't need our help and they don't need our boots on the ground. The second recommendation from the Pentagon of attacking ISIS across the globe is dangerous and stupid. We've seen in the past that anytime we bomb a country believing that we're going to get rid of the jihadists there, we just end up creating more jihadists there. If we look at Somalia or Yemen, Al-Qaeda in those countries were very small. Now Al-Qaeda, or in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, has a very large presence and controls territory in those countries. And now ISIS is rising in both of those countries as well and taking territory and carrying out terrorist attacks. Same thing in Afghanistan. I highlighted on Monday's show how ISIS was moving from just being in the east of the country to now being in the north. In Iraq and Syria, the Al-Qaeda presence was pretty small prior to U.S. invasion of Iraq. Post the invasion of Iraq, we now have ISIS being a massive threat in the two countries, and while they're certainly being defeated in both of those countries, ISIS would have never existed if it wasn't for the U.S. intervention in the first place. So I'm not sure who they plan on bombing or where, but they're not going to be able to get rid of ISIS. They're only going to spread ISIS. One detail Trump did give during the speech about how he planned to defeat ISIS was to work with our allies in the region. Our allies in the region include Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and Turkey. A lot of those countries bought oil from ISIS and encouraged the rise of ISIS while, kind of before the U.S. got involved. a lot of ISIS fighters came through the Turkish border, and a lot of ISIS oil crossed over the Turkish border to be sold. Saudi Arabia is a known financer of jihadist groups, and Israel's policy for the situation in Syria is to make the conflict last as long as possible. So it seems that our allies in the region are the only ones that really aren't working to help the situation at all, where you have Assad in Syria, who we don't like, and Russia and Iran actively working and doing a pretty good job to get rid of ISIS in that region. So our enemies are doing a better job to get rid of ISIS than our allies. Speaking of Iran, Trump then moved into talking and bragging about the new sanctions that he put on Iran. Sanctions don't work, and I went over this in a previous episode titled "Sanctions Are Stupid and Do Not Work." So if you're interested in learning about sanctions, I would check that out. In this case, with the sanctions against Iran are just completely unnecessary. Iran is allowed to test ballistic missiles, and they didn't break any international treaties by testing these missiles. I believe it was probably the Iran hawks in Trump's cabinet that got him all worked up over Iran and got him to push these new sanctions against Iran. Overall, all these sanctions are doing is making the Iran deal less appealing to the Iranians, because if there's tons of sanctions on Iran, then what's the point of the Iranians following the nuclear deal anyways? Trump also talked about affirming our alliance with Israel. Our alliance with Israel has been one of the most destructive policies that we've had. We have a situation in Syria where Israel's policy is to have the conflict last as long as possible. That's not in the U.S. interest. We don't want the conflict to last as long as possible. The longer the conflict lasts, the more refugees that are created, the more terrorists that are created, and the more disastrous. I mean, it's terrible on a humanitarian standpoint, but it's also terrible from a utilitarian standpoint of the U.S., because if you have a country with large open territory that could be occupied by jihadists, it becomes a breeding ground for jihadists, and definitely not something that the U.S. wants to see. Trump has also been more critical of Israel settlements than past presidents. Obama wasn't really critical of Israel until maybe 7.5 years into his 8-year term. So it's interesting that he would say that he's reaffirmed our relationship with Israel, when in reality he's been a little bit more critical of our relationship with Israel than other presidents. Trump mentions that he inherited foreign policy disasters. He's right. The Middle East is a disaster. Obama and Bush and Clinton and Bush really set the Middle East on fire, and it bombed 7 or 8 countries across the Middle East over those 4 presidents. There's pretty much been consistent war in Iraq for 25 years. But rather than Trump doing a 180 on the policy that he understands created a complete disaster, he continues it. He's not doing anything different than Obama did. He's not doing anything different than Bush did. If anything, he's doing their policies a little bit more. Maybe he'll drop more bombs or put more troops on the ground, but as we've seen in the past, that's not a solution to any of these problems. It just continues the problems. It makes the problems worse. So if Trump understands that there's a complete disaster, our foreign policy has been a complete disaster in the Middle East, I don't understand why he doesn't do the opposite of what our foreign policy has been over the past 25 years and stop intervening rather than intervening more. But I guess we can't expect that much out of Trump. While his rhetoric during the campaign seemed to be a little bit more non-interventionist since taking office and really since being elected, he has been a real hawk on Russia, a real hawk on the foreign policy in general, saying that we need to win the wars rather than just realizing that the wars are unwinnable and should have never been entered by the U.S. in the first place. While Trump was talking about infrastructure, he mentioned that the U.S. has spent $6 trillion in these overseas wars. It's fantastic that Trump realizes this. Like the past point is fantastic that he realizes that our foreign policy has been a complete disaster. But again, his solution isn't to say, well, we just need to stop meddling in the Middle East and go home. His solution is that we're going to spend more money on defense. So this is completely insane. Trump mentions how the $6 trillion could have been spent on infrastructure. I agree that the $6 trillion could have been spent better in any way whatsoever than blowing up things in the Middle East and killing people for absolutely no reason. I really can't think of a worse way the money could have been spent unless we spent it on war with Russia maybe. So, it's good that he realizes that this money could have been spent more effectively in different ways. However, everything he's done since he's taken office doesn't suggest that he's going to change the policy at all, but he does realize it's a problem. After talking about how much money the U.S. has wasted on wars in the Middle East, Trump went on to talking about how he plans to waste more money on wars in the Middle East. Trump says that he plans to spend an extra $57 or $54 billion a year on defense spending. He talks about this being a record defense budget increase. In previous talks, he had mentioned that he's going to give a lot of this money to the shipbuilders. I'm kind of confused on what he wants to spend more money on defense on. The U.S. already spends more money on defense than the next 8 countries in the world combined, and half of those countries are our allies, not our enemies. So at this point, I mean, we're just setting our money on fire. We spent tons of money on the F-35 project. That's been a total disaster. We've spent tons of money on the Fort Zumwalt class of ships, and those have been total disaster. They're breaking down everywhere. It seems that the more money we spend on these weapons of war, the less utility we get out of them. And this is probably what happens. The bigger the bureaucracy, the more money you spend on these projects, the less well they're going to do, because they're more bureaucratic and less designed for utility. The F-35 is built in 48 states. That way you can never kill the F-35 project, because all these congressmen are going to have to answer to their constituents as to why they voted for a bill that costs jobs to their district. So we're really left with a situation where we're stuck with this crappy plane that's pretty much unusable. Yeah, and so Trump wants to spend more money on these kinds of projects. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely stupid, and he should completely stop doing it. And like you mentioned before, we've already wasted enough money on these wars in the Middle East. Why not take this $54 billion and spend it on, well, anything else, or just not spend it, since we're already $20 trillion in debt? But Trump doesn't seem to understand where his own logic leads him to, and is just kind of fumbling around in the darkness and saying things that get applause. In fact, I think when Trump made this statement, we saw Chuck Schumer stand up for one of the only times during Trump's speech and lick his lips a little bit, really excited about all of his big top money weapons maker donors going to be getting big paychecks because Trump's going to increase the defense budget. It's absolutely disgusting what's going on. Our congressmen are corrupt, our president's corrupt, and the whole system's a giant mess. Trump then moves into talking about the raid in Yemen and thanks the wife of the soldier who died in Yemen. Of course, absolutely no mention of any of the Yemeni people that were killed in the raid. The 8-year-old little American citizen girl who was killed by a U.S. bullet. Nothing of that. Just praise the hero of the soldier who died. While I certainly don't think the soldier's a hero, he went to a foreign country where we don't belong and we aren't wanted, and killed a bunch of innocent people and was killed in the process. I don't necessarily condemn the man. I don't think it's his fault that he grew up in a civilization and a culture that says you should join the military, and that joining the military is honorable, and that following the orders that you receive in the military is honorable. But at the same time, this isn't behavior that we should praise either. It's just unfortunate that his life was ended fighting in a foreign country that he didn't belong in. And so his wife got a big round of applause. I talked about this soldier last time and his father being upset with Trump and wanting to know what intel we gained in the raid. Trump talked about the success of the raid. However, the White House recently came out and said that the intelligence we got in the raid wasn't that meaningful. So more discoordination coming out of the Trump administration there, where you have within a couple day period the White House admitting that no good intel came from the raid, and then Trump bragging about the intel we got from the raid. So that's a little disturbing. Then Trump makes a statement that I found fairly disturbing. He talked about how the Bible teaches us that there is no greater act than to die for your friends or your country, in relation to the U.S. soldier who died in Yemen. However, the soldier didn't die for his country. He died because some moron president sent him to a country that he didn't belong in for information that didn't exist to kill a bunch of civilians. We didn't even kill a good Al-Qaeda target in that raid. We just killed a bunch of civilians. You can't call that death an honorable death. President Trump, you killed this soldier for absolutely no reason. And while it makes you feel good to say that his death was honorable, it simply wasn't. He died killing a bunch of children. That's just disturbing. And you put him in that situation. This is your fault that he died that death. And don't use religion to cover up the fact that you killed a bunch of innocent people and allowed an American soldier to die. It's absolutely one of the more disturbing statements I've ever heard come out of a president's mouth. All right, a few more talking points that Trump made about foreign policy during his speech. He emphasized the importance of the NATO alliance and said that NATO allies must meet financial obligations. This echoes what he said during his campaign, that the U.S. is basically subsidizing the defense of other countries because other countries don't spend a lot on defense because they know America is going to take care of them in their national defense. I think the NATO alliance at this point is obsolete. The Soviet Union no longer exists. This is 2017, not 1967. So it's time to move on past NATO and try to get along with Russia. However, as long as NATO exists, I guess the more other countries spend, maybe the less the United States could spend, although Trump plans on spending more. So, I mean, there's really no advantage to this here. It's just going to lead to more warfare. And Trump closed out with two more small statements on foreign policy that were of note. One was, he said, we will respect the foreign rights of all countries. This kind of sounded like maybe he could have said sovereignty here. However, this simply isn't what's going on. Yemen doesn't really want us conducting raids in that country, but we're going to continue to do it. Syria has said several times that the United States isn't welcome there, and we continue to bomb there and support people in that country. So this is just a hypocritical statement by Trump that simply isn't true. We're not going to respect the sovereignty of other countries. However, if American sovereignty is ever disrespected, you better believe that the United States is going to go full war on those countries. In fact, one of the few times in the past 30 years or so American sovereignty wasn't respected, during 9/11, a terrorist group carried out an attack against the United States, and in response we destroyed two countries. One of them that had absolutely nothing to do with the attack, and the other that was willing to give up the man who carried out the attack, but the United States wouldn't take their deal on it. So one of the last statements he made sounded positive, and that was he wants to create a situation in the Middle East where people could return home and that we don't have so many refugees. I absolutely agree that this is a good idea. I think that the people of the Middle East would probably rather stay in their homes around their family and their countrymen rather than, have their homes blown up and have to flee their countries. However, unless Trump's policy is going to be to stop bombing these countries, then this simply isn't going to happen. Once again, a really hypocritical statement on behalf of Trump, rather than advocating for something more practical, which is we're going to stop bombing these countries so these people could go home. He says we need to find a way to get these people to go home, but then advocates for more bombing in these countries, which isn't going to create that situation. Well, that was Trump's State of the Union speech. I pretty much went in order of his speech here. I didn't group it up too much. These are all the statements he made on foreign policy. He talked about a lot of other things as well, and I think foreign policy probably encompassed maybe 20% of his total speech, maybe a little bit less. Overall, it wasn't the worst things he could have said, but certainly had some disturbing statements and a lot of contradictory statements where he would say, we want peace, but we're going to bomb more people. So, I mean, I don't think we have a whole lot of good things to look forward to in the Trump administration, but I guess we can all cross our fingers and hope that maybe he realizes that the more we bomb countries, the more refugees we create, and the bigger problem that these refugees are for the world. But I doubt that's going to happen, especially with the people that Trump surrounded himself with. Trump did talk a lot about other policy during the speech, but I'm not going to address it here because this is my foreign policy podcast, and so I just addressed the foreign policy stuff. If anybody is interested in my comments on the other parts of Trump's speech, I would check out the weekly Freedom File for this week. That should be coming out probably on Thursday. That would be tomorrow if you're listening to the podcast on the day it comes out. And that's all I have for Foreign Policy Focus today. If you like the show, I would suggest going to iTunes and subscribing, leaving me a 5-star rating and review. If you want to go and see all the episodes of the show, the best place to do that is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. You could go to my Facebook page, Foreign Policy Focus. It's a group. We have chats in there about foreign policy and other stuff. You can also go to my website to get my daily news roundups and to see all the episodes of the show as well. That's kylesfilesblog.com, files spelled F-Y-L-E-S. You can also follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE, and all my work is always at thelibertarianinstitute.org on the blog, so I would check that out. The Libertarian Institute's an awesome group with tons of good stories where I get a lot of my information, so if you want to be more informed, check them out. Thanks, everybody. See you on Friday.